Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hi everyone, welcome to an in-between episode where I answer any question that you have about history. Today's question is, did Vikings have tattoos? This is a good question because I've noticed a few things on the internet where you'll see runic scripts that look like they're from the runic alphabet of Vikings, and you'll see guys who will get these tattoos on them. You can do Google image searches and find people who have these. Maybe they're fans of the show Vikings on Showtime, and there's an idea that they had this really rough and tumble bro type of guy with the dreaded hair ready to pillage a Celtic monastery. Really tough image, but the question is, did they actually have these, and do we have any historical counts of runic scripts adorning Viking arms as they sail their longships down fjords? Material remains of Vikings offer few cultures because this is a culture that doesn't have a lot of manuscripts of its own, and a lot of what we know about Vikings comes from archaeology, where it wouldn't really depict their tattoos, or it comes from their adversaries, and they might not offer a lot of information about their physical description. But we do have a few accounts that say, yes, at least for those Vikings who plied their trade down the Volga with their goods and traveled throughout Russia, Central Asia, and even down into the Middle East. The Norsemen, as they were known, or Vikings from the Old Norse word vikingar, encountered Arab statesmen and chroniclers who carried on extensive trade and cultural exchange with Norsemen in the 9th and 10th centuries. Arabic language accounts are among the most numerous of this period due to the economic and intellectual powerhouse of the Abbasid Caliphate at this time, which was much richer than almost any principality in Europe. There were the Byzantines as well, and they had quite a few encounters with the Vikings, but the Abbasids provide good accounts. There was an Arab traveler named Ahmad ibn Faldan, a scholar of Baghdad, and he was sent by the Abbasid Caliph on a diplomatic mission to the Bulgars in the middle Volga area of Russia. He first met Norse warriors as he traveled along Russia's vast steppes. He encountered them as they sailed longships down the Volga River and were looking to trade with the Arab world. And they did a lot of trade. We found gold from the Abbasid Caliphate all throughout Sweden and Scandinavia in the 800s and 900s. Ibn Faldan, in 921, met a people called the Rus, who were Swedish traders who had brought slaves to sell at local markets. Ibn Faldan described the Rus in his Traveler Chronicler. He called them Russia, an Arabic way to say the Russians or the people of Rus, now commonly known as the Vikings. He said, "I have never seen bodies as nearly perfect as theirs. As tall as palm trees, fair and reddish, they wear neither tunics nor kaftans. Every man wears a cloak with which he covers half of his body so that one arm is uncovered. They carry axes, swords, and daggers, and always have them in hand. They use Frankish swords with broad, rigid blades." At one point, Ibn Faldan mentions that all the men were tattooed from the tips of their fingers to their necks. The tattoos were dark green figures of trees and symbols. It's likely, however, that the tattoos were probably dark blue, a color that comes from using wood ash to dye the skin. While Ibn Faldan describes the tattoos as trees, he could have seen the Rus trademark of a gripping beast or other knotwork patterns of which the Vikings were fond. To him, they resembled the women's neck rings of gold and silver. However, we can't be completely sure that Ibn Faldan is trying to write an eyewitness account. A lot of times these chroniclers will use a person's appearance less as an accurate description and more as a rhetorical device to depict the people of their description a certain way. And in this episode, he's trying to depict the savagery of the Norsemen. And the Arabs consider them with a combination of fascination but also horror. Ibn Faldan, we know he considers them with horror because he saves his harshest words for their hygiene. He says, "They are the filthiest of God's creatures. Although he acknowledged that they wash their hands, faces, and heads every day, he was appalled that they did so in the dirtiest and filthiest fashion possible in a communal basin of water." This was particularly offsetting to a Muslim who carried on his ablutions with strict attention to detail. Well, we do have other evidence outside of Ibn Khaldun's account. A Scythian chieftain was found in Siberia who had been buried around 500 BC that might have had ancient ancestral cultural connections to the Vikings of Scandinavia. He was buried beneath permafrost, so his skin and tattoos survived. Well, the popularity of such designs has trickled down to today. Many tattoo artists have designed Norse tattoos, particularly the compass tattoo, called the Vegvisir. However, the symbol is not from the Viking Age. It dates to the 17th century from an Icelandic book on magic. Another popular design is the Helm of Awe. This symbol allows the wearer to strike his enemies with fear and confusion, and it's also thought to grant magical powers to his wearer. All that to say, if you want to go out and get a Viking tattoo, know that you are in fact standing in a true historical lineage that goes back for several centuries. Well, thank you very much for listening to this episode. Before we wrap up, I'd like to mention a few things. First of all, I'd like to thank the wonderful people who have left reviews for this podcast on iTunes, and I'd like to read a few of them. Alex from the US wrote on August 29th, "I love how Scott dives into history to answer intriguing questions that aren't normally asked. History Unplugged is both interesting, entertaining, and educational," and he left a 5-star review. And I'd also like to read a 3-star review from a listener in Denmark, and he says, "This is a good podcast that covers historical subjects that you may not have heard of. But one thing I wish was better is the sound quality when you have guests on the show. Maybe it's because I am Danish and American is not my native language, but you had an episode about a pilot from World War II that had been over Japan, and it was almost impossible to hear when he was in windy areas." Well, thank you for the criticism. That was an episode where I talked to Jerry Yellen, a World War II fighter pilot. Jerry was outside when he did the interview, and let me tell you, I had to do a lot of post-production to make that even listenable. Well, thank you. I'm glad that we have listeners in Denmark. I love the concept of hygge. I've tried to light candles, my wife and I, in our house in winter, and tell you what, those Danes have really brought something good to world culture with the contribution of hygge. Well, thank you for the commentary, and I love it when people leave comments, whether good or bad or whatever. I just like the dialogue, and if there's stuff you want me to improve on, I'm always open to listening. And if you would like to submit a question that I would answer for this podcast, you can do so by going to historyunpluggedpodcast.com. There, I will take your questions and gladly answer anything that you can throw at me. Thanks for listening to the History Unplugged podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get your daily dose of all things history related, from ancient Greece to the Cold War. You can do that by going to historyonthenet.com/subscribe. Speaking of history on the net, if you want to dive deeper, go to our site historyonthenet.com, and there you'll find blog posts, book reviews, and all of our other podcast episodes. Plus, don't forget to rate and review this podcast so we can bring you the best daily history content possible. We'll see you next time at the History Unplugged podcast.